Thank you, Shali, for asking to speak in this session. So I'm going to be telling you all about a little bit about autofluorescence imaging, which has become a very, very strong, powerful tool in the last few years. Just to give you a little background of what autofluorescence means, we have to understand that these photoreceptor outer segments are digested by the RPE cells on a regular basis, particularly early morning hours of the day. As the sun rises, these get phagocytosed and processed. And what you have ultimately is a byproduct of this phagocytic process and degraded molecules of this outer segment are leftovers keep on accumulating in the RPE cells. And there's no, RPE doesn't have any mechanisms to get rid of these material, which we call, for the sake of simplicity, lipofuscin. There are so many other such materials, degraded materials. These stay in the RPE cells for the rest of the lifetime, and they keep on getting accumulated. Now, they have a peculiar property of showing fluorescence. If you, reflect a blue light, they will, emerge green fluorescence. So fluorescence is all about the exposing or exciting a material with a lower wavelength, and you get the reflectance or the emission of a higher wavelength. So that is the principle of the autofluorescence. So because this material is contained in the RPE cells, so studying the property of this autofluorescence, by a simple non-invasive tool, you could assess what's going on there. You could use a fundus camera, which we use conventionally with the eyes of the TOPCon, using certain excitation filters. The only issue with this kind of camera is that as the age advances, the crystalline lens also has some of these fluorophores, which are fluorescent and may not yield very good quality of images. But by and large, this is what it should look like. The normal fundus, there is a diffuse, fine hyperfluorescence. The disc is black or hypoautofluorescent because there is no autofluorescent material in the optic disc. The vessels appear dark because the blue light gets absorbed by the blood in the vessels. The fovea appears dark in these images because of absorption of light by the luteal pigment. This is on the Spectralis, which use a confocal scanning laser ophthalmoscope to obtain the same images, and you can see the images here are much sharper. So you could use a blue light, or you could use a near-infrared light, and you could get a little more information with near-infrared images, but more commonly used is a blue light fundus autofluorescence, and this is precisely how you should be looking at a normal fundus. Now, we expect that if there is no RPE cells, there will be no autofluorescence there. So this will appear as hypoautofluorescence. So we use the terms like hypo or reduced fluorescence or increased fluorescence. If there is accumulation of these particulate matter in the RPE cells, excessive accumulation will lead to a phenomena of hyper or increased autofluorescence. And I'll give you some of the examples. Like one of the first examples of how this came into clinical practice was a case of macular hole. Like in a macular hole, you would see a central hyperautofluorescence because now there is no neurosensory retina overlying that pigment epithelium. So it is the normal autofluorescence of the pigment epithelium, which is now seen through this window, which has been created by the macular full thickness macular hole. And once you cover this, with surgery, you close the macular hole, you assume a normal hypoautofluorescence of the fovea. Likewise, you would anticipate now that if there is a choroidal scar in the retina, this would not have any pigment. RPE cells would lost, so these lesions would be appearing all hypoautofluorescent. Now, one of the nice examples to understand this is a patient. If you examine this patient clinically, it will be hard to diagnose a RPE rip. Whereas if you saw the autofluorescence image of the same patient, you can see the area where the RPE has been ripped appear dark because there is no autofluorescence because there is no RP there, and the area where the RP is kind of folded over or rolled over, now it has the 2 layers of the RP in that area. So you can see this edge, which is the rolled over RP, showing an increased autofluorescence. So this is a very simple way of understanding the mechanism of this imaging technique. Likewise, if you had to see this disc, you would be ordering MRI. I would order a fundus autofluorescence image because this patient doesn't have disc edema per se, but has buried bruises. The buried bruises in the optic nerve head are autofluorescent. So it's very simple to diagnose some of these conditions, otherwise it will pose a challenge. Now this lady, for instance, has this yellowish deposit in the retina. For years, we used to do a fluorescent angiogram and it will show some late increased fluorescence of this lesion. And for years, we didn't understand what was going on, and we all believed that this patient had occult choroidal neovascular membrane. And since, these were the early days of anti-VEGF therapy, so this lady got a number of these anti-VEGF injections without any benefit to the patient in terms of the lesion or the vision. And what you realize is, over a period of time, this yellowish lesion in the retina or subretinal space is increasing in size. And the moment we had this facility of about 5 years ago, we started doing autofluorescence imaging, and this is what you get here is an excessive accumulation of lipofuscin in this particular entity, which I'll show you later in the next segment of my talk, which is adult onset foveo-macular vitelline like dystrophy or vitelline dystrophy, which is essentially a collection of lipofuscin material due to non-degradation of the outer segments of the photoreceptors. Now we know that this does not require anti-VEGF therapy. So a situation which looked so difficult or challenging became so easy to diagnose and manage once you know the power of this tool. Likewise, in Stargardt's disease, you see this. You can see the loss of the RPE here and the photoreceptors, and the flecks are seen as the flecks are where the lipofuscin is accumulated focally, and they appear bright or hyper-autofluorescent. Likewise, in a patient like this patient, it will be hard to diagnose. This is a dry macular degeneration. You don't know what's going on, but the moment you do fundus autofluorescence image, you see all those areas which are bright. They have the ones which are metabolically active, accumulating lipofuscin, and all these dark areas are, in fact, hypoautofluorescent areas are where the RP as well as the overlying photoreceptors have disappeared and are dead. So we can actually see these areas, and we know that these areas where there is a hyperautofluorescence, there is excessive accumulation of lipofuscin. These are the areas where the RP cells are going to die. So you can actually look at the course of the disease. You can prognosticate that this guy is actually going to have these cells dying in the next few months or years, and this is a progressive dry macular degeneration. I'll give you an example here of the patient again. You can see very subtle hypopigmented lesion in the foveal center, but when you see on fundus autofluorescence, you can see the white arrow here showing very clearly. You can actually measure this, and over a period of time you can see the progression rate of these hypoautofluorescence. And the yellow arrow is indicating the accumulation of the lipofuscin, another adjacent area. We know that this is the next area which is going to die, and we'll have lots of photoreceptors and the RP cells over there. Now this is a gentleman who has been treated for wet ARMD. Now you would know that ARMD has two components, a wet and a dry ARMD. Now we have a solution for wet component, that is CNV, can be treated with using any of the anti-VEGF agents, but still we don't have any remedy for the progressive dry AMD. Now we'll see through the course of this patient, and as we see in 2005 years ago, he had this area of hypoautofluorescence. This is the area. The fovea is good, and after Western injections he is getting 6/6 vision, but you can see this area, adjacent area, is the one which is hyperautofluorescence. We know that this is the one which is going to be the next on the target of degeneration, and this is what exactly is happening 10 months later, as you can see here, and later and later, you can see over a period of 3 years, this patient has shown a remarkable progression. And this is where we can really see how the vision, despite his getting anti-VEGF agent, despite having no subretinal fluid or intraretinal fluid, he continues to have a deterioration of vision because of progression in the geographic atrophy or a progression of the dry component of the ARMD. And same is seen in the left eye. The same phenomena was seen in the left eye, and he lost vision in the left eye much before he lost in the right eye. So this is what the phenomenon is showing. Now I'm going to show you a patient of a serpiginous choroiditis. It's a classic serpiginous choroiditis. When we look at this progression of the disease over a period of 1.5 years, it's very difficult for anyone, unless you are really a great expert in analyzing these images, when you're looking at these colored pictures, to say that this disease is progressive or which area is likely to progress. Okay, the clue may be like here, a little orangish color at the tip, but the moment you see the fundus autofluorescence image, the dark areas are the dead, where there is no RPE, there is no choriocapital, there is no photoreceptors, but these hyperautofluorescent areas are where this you can see here. These are the ones which are showing actually a progression, and this is where the lesion is next going to extend. So you can actually study the course of the disease using this as a tool. Another patient, and this is where you can see the active serpiginous-like choroiditis active lesion here, and show this kind of fluorescence. When we manage these patients, they acquire a hypo ring around the lesion, and as they heal, they get some kind of a stippled or mixed fluorescence, which is dark and hyper. And when you want to see these patients, you don't have to do now angiograms. You don't have to do anything but do fundus autofluorescence image to see the area of activity from the course of this patient. For instance, another patient here, where from the active stage, as it starts sealing, as it keeps on decreasing these hyper, and finally these lesions the hyperautofluorescence will disappear, showing that now metabolically the disease is dead, it's run through its course. Another patient, to show the similar phenomena, you can see how well you can pick it up on the fundus autofluorescence. And 2 weeks later, and when you want to do similar kind of progression here to hypo lesions. So to summarize, autofluorescence is a tool. Now we have experience of more than 5 years. World over, probably they have experience of similar kind of 6 or 7 years. It's a new imaging technique, but it's a very powerful tool to study principally the macular disorders, especially the age-related macular degeneration, and the various lipofuscinopathies, which we were hard put to diagnose these lipofuscinopathies in the past because of poor understanding of, and there was no tool to image the lipofuscin in the retina. So it's a non-invasive tool, and I'll strongly urge the participants here to use this technology in day-to-day clinical practice, so that you could deliver, to your patients what they need. Thank you. I think this is the continuation of my previous talk. Now, when we say multimodal, what it means essentially is that you from using a single tool, you could acquire different types of images, including blue light reflectance, or what we call red-free, or you could have near-infrared images, you could have fundus autofluorescence images, or you could do the angiographies. We are all familiar with fundus fluorescent angiography. You could also do ICG, and now you can also combine all these 5 imaging which gives you a topographic evaluation or topographic information, as well as they give you the vascular component of the retina. You could combine them with now OCT, the spectral domain OCT and high resolution OCT, to give you a composite information, and you could combine any of these, like fundus autofluorescence, you can combine with OCT, so that you would have a topographic as well as a tomographic evaluation of essentially the posterior pole. I'm going to run through some of these examples to highlight what I wish to show. Now this is a 60-year-old lady. I'm sure you would in your practice like to document this is what showing a hypofluorescent lesion. I'm sure anybody would be able to diagnose that, well, this is a geographic atrophy, and you can see a few bruises here. You can barely see some of these choroidal vessels, but if you saw a near infrared image, as you know, that will penetrate through all the pigments, and you'll be able to get a deeper perspective of the retina in the pigment epithelium as well as the choroid, and you can see this kind of information here. When you use the fundus autofluorescence, what you are seeing here is a hypoautofluorescence. This is what I've just gone through in my previous talk. So this is when you are using a single image, standalone image, but if you combine it, for instance, in this patient, now when you want to see what exactly is going on, in this area of hypoautofluorescence, you would realize, if you can see it very briefly, there is no pigment epithelium in this area. There is no outer retinal, outer nuclear layer here. There's a little bit of the inner nuclear layer, and the inner retina is preserved. So what we know now in geographic atrophy has no loss, the loss of RPE, the loss of the outer retina, the photoreceptor layer is gone, but the inner retina is preserved. Another patient, I'm sure you all see these kind of patients, a young female patient comes with a hemorrhagic pigment epithelial detachment, loss of vision. Now what would you do in this kind of setting is order ICG to look for what she has, and this is what we did, and the blood is all dark here, and you can see a little bit of emergence of the increased fluorescence, and this is what you see, increasing fluorescence in this particular patient. So you know something is actually growing there, which is caused this hemorrhage, and you want to know what exactly is this and what is happening to this, and then you combine this information. Now what you see here is exactly this line is cutting through the section. It's a horizontal section cutting through the area, and right here is this polyp. It's a polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy which has led to the RPE, hemorrhagic RPE detachment. This is what you can see here, and the polyp is sitting right here. Now what we planned to do in this patient was, because she had lost vision, so I thought we'll do partial vitreous surgery using a TPA and a gas, and she went through the procedure and she regained her vision. But look at this. Now we don't know what's going on here. This is almost about 4 weeks after this surgery, and you can see the foveal reflex very nicely. The blood has been drained, but there's something which you don't know what's going on. So what we do is we do autofluorescence, and we find that there is the area of intense hypoautofluorescence showing thereby that perhaps there is no RP there, and there is an increased area of autofluorescence. So we are back again to that fundus autofluorescence image, and we realize that something is going on. So what we do is cut a section on OCT. Now this is exactly passing through the area. Now you can see in this area there is no RPE, and this is the flap of the RPE here, which you can see, and then again there is a loss. So this is a demonstration of an RP rip which happened following the partial vitreous surgery, which left behind, as you can see here, it did leave behind, in an attempt to drain sub-RP blood, left behind RP rip, and we exactly understand what was going on there. Now if you compare to the OCT, now we want to see. Now the beauty of this technology, a multimodal imaging technology, is that you can exactly put your cursor on a point and see in the follow-up. So this is what we call point-to-point registration, because the imaging speed is so high, and there is a tracking device inside, so you can go back to any image in the past, and you want to track that lesion after 6 months, a year, or several years later. You can exactly put your cursor there and see what was happening to that point in later life. And this is what exactly was where we had placed our cursor right here at the polyp. This is before the surgery, and you can see that polyp is gone now. And you can also see the PED, which was seen earlier, has also disappeared. Okay, so this is the power of this multimodal imaging, that it tells you what exactly is happening, not only topographically but also tomographically. We go to another patient, and this is a 65 years old lady who presented with this kind of picture, and we did an OCT. Now here is a C-section, as you cut the onions, it's a C-section of the OCT, and you can see here on a slice, this is the RPE here, or the PED, as you can see here. Because as you know, this curvature of the globe, when you are cutting a slice, it doesn't exactly fit the RPE, so we have the software to make it RPE fit, and this is what it looks like. A fairly circular, regular cut of the pigment epithelial detachment. Now we plan to give injection of Avastin to this lady because of her poor vision, and the angiogram had shown a CNV. So this is what we did, and this is the OCT just before the Avastin injection. And see what happened to this patient. A month after the first injection of intravenous intravitreal Avastin, this is what the patient looks like. So we don't know what's going on till we have access to the multimodal images. And this is what we see here. We are cutting a section here, and what you're seeing here, the same RP fit here shows that there is a rip here, and this is what you are seeing here as the folded flap of the torn RPE. You go on to see this on the autofluorescence image. You can see this is the area where the RP is ripped, and this is still the RP is present, and with little bit of exudation fluid there. We followed this up, and we now know that there is a continuous progression of this RPE in this particular patient. And well, this is another patient which I want to show you again, a yellowish central deposit. Okay, and we know now this when you do it, fundus autofluorescence image, you see an area of intense hyper autofluorescence, as I dealt with in the last lecture. This is a lipofuscin deposit. But sometime later, this lady comes with a normal vision, and she now complains of blurring. So what's happened? There is a change in the picture. That yellow deposit is no longer visible. Okay, so what's happening? What's happening is this hyperintense fluorescence that was seen has now become intensely hypoautofluorescence. So this lipofuscin has gone, disappeared. There are several theories, but what you do here is you want to see what's happening, and this is what you see here, that there is a loss of the RPE in this area. So once this RPE is lost, so autofluorescence, the lipofuscin material disappeared from here, and you know why the patient is getting, when you move it up, you see the RPE layer is seen very nicely, and the external limiting membrane. But when you go down, you see that there's a gap there. Now, interestingly, we followed this patient for years, and what you find here is this was the central area where there was loss of the lipofuscin, and this is another couple of areas where this lipofuscin yellowish material started accumulating. When you do a tomographic correlation, what you find is that this is the edge which is now getting hyperautofluorescent, and this shows the deposit of this material over the RPE and under the ISOS junction, and this is where already this has been lost, the RPE has been lost, but there is a fresh accumulation of this particular material. I'll illustrate with another patient whom we have followed, and in fact this patient, when we didn't understand, received quite a few of these Avastin injections because the fluorescent angiogram mimics an occult CNV. So we were following this patient, and he was going ahead very nice, 6/18 vision with cataract, and fairly happy. And this is what the OCT shows, that there is the accumulation of this material here over the RPE. Till he comes back, and suddenly we found from something which was hyper autofluorescent again has become hypoautofluorescence. This lipofuscin suddenly overnight disappeared. Where did it go? So This is what we did. And this is what we find, that there is a rip. So this is the material which is accumulating. This is hanging from the ISOS junction. This material, lipofuscin, because this is coming from the outer segments. Now outer segments are not able to reach for a number of reasons to the RP cells, the apical process of the RP cells. So this accumulates, keeps on accumulating, and it is, as I said, autofluorescent. Now you can see this material hanging there, but what has happened is that there is a rip, and this has been dumped it's been taken away now by the macrophages. Now when you see this right in the center, there's a gap, is corresponding, this is the cursor here, which is corresponding to this line here. Now when you go to this hyperautofluorescent area, I put the cursor here, it shows that this is where this material is now accumulating there. When I go to, and many of these patients would be associated with dry RMD changes, and when we go to this, I put my cursor on this drusen, we know that this is an nodular elevation under the RPE. So this is a drusen. So using this, you can actually, any lesion in the retina, you could know where it is located, in front of the RPE, under the RPE, and what's going on, the pathogenesis. Interestingly, this guy also, years later, starts showing accumulation of the fresh lipofuscin materials. It's an ongoing process. This fellow doesn't have the capability to process the lipofuscin. So this is what you can see here, the accumulation of this lipofuscin. The other eye has still showing a hyperautofluorescent pathology. I'll just quickly go through some of these patients. This is a young 59 years old lady who shows a lesion here, interesting lesion, and some hyperautofluorescence when we do. Now this is where you can do a simultaneous angiogram. You can use angiography as well as you can do OCT, and what you are seeing here, the angiogram, fluorescent angiogram, and this is the ICG, and you can see these two lesions which are becoming intensely hyperautofluorescent. And this is what in late frame that shows that even on angiogram this one is, now we don't know what it is. Is it a polyp or is it something else? Because polyps don't show well on fundus fluorescent angiography that we have been taught, and they show up only on the ICG. Here it's seen much more on the fluorescent angiogram than on the ICG. But when we do the spectralis multimodal imaging, then we're passing through this, we can see that there is what we call occult chorioretinal anastomosis or ocular lesion. And the treatment for these ocular lesions is use of anti-VEGF agents. This is what we did, and it shows the resolution of this subretinal fluid which was making this patient symptomatic, and this patient has been followed for a long time now. This is another patient, a similar example. We're running out of time here, so I'll just show you how a similar ocular lesion was managed. And you can see this is 3 days after this shows a little bit of increase of the intraretinal cyst, but after 3 injections, the patient from 624 has improved to 6.6 vision. I think I have shown you all these, except I want to show you the one. Here is a patient with lesions here in the choroid, and when you do the angiogram, you can see on ICG the full thickness choroidal granulomas. And when you combine this with OCT and the information from the ICG, and you can see these granulomas in the choroid using enhanced depth imaging as they show response to your treatment with corticosteroids. Some of these patients may pose a challenge like retinitis, toxoplasma retinitis, or is it chorioretinitis. When you do the OCT here, we know exactly this is a retinitis lesion here. There is nothing wrong with the choroid here, and this is how it shows on this. So to conclude, what I've shown you a few patients which demonstrated a very unique opportunity to study simultaneously several imaging techniques. I think it's one of the best tools to correlate the topographic information with the tomographic information, with the vascular information of the retina, and to follow up on these patients, to monitor the progress of the disease. Now we don't have to actually keep on doing repeated invasive procedure like ICGs and fluorescent angiogram, and this has certainly personal level, it has helped me to understand the macular pathology which we didn't understand till some years ago. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
For telling us the role of autofluorescence in multimodal imaging. Now Dr. Raman is going to talk about some of the investigations which we still have to use even in the retina. So what is the role of these modalities he's going to cover over the next 12 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal Ali, for making me part of this course. Very good morning to everybody. As I move along in this course, in this talk, I'll be showing you the definite and irrepressible role of USG in diagnosing the posterior segment disorder. While MRI and PET directly, they can just we can visualize some of these intraocular tumors, but their definite and the better role is in diagnosing the systemic associations of these tumors. So as we all know that I don't think there's still now a substitute there to USG in diagnosing the posterior segment in case of opaque media, be it non-traumatic cases, be it trauma, be it uveitis. And in intraocular tumors, it provides the diagnosis to us most of the situations. In few cases, we need CT, MRI, or PET to confirm it, but most of the time it comes out with the diagnosis. Whenever you're seeing a USG, you are seeing for things like vitreous, retinocoroid, and disc. And once you are looking at the vitreous, and there are some point-like or dot-like echoes which will give you a clue that whatever you're seeing in the vitreous is normal or not. And depending on the A scan and B scan, you will pick up the vitritis, endophthalmitis, and uterus hemorrhage. It is very important here to keep the clinical picture always in mind, because if you don't know the clinical picture, you will not make a good diagnosis. Because if you have a hypopyon in front of the eye and you keep making a diagnosis of vitreous hemorrhage behind, you are making a big mistake. So you always think of horses outside when you hear the clatter of hoofs, not zebras here. And once a patient presents with a post-cataract surgery inflammation, look for the things like a nucleus there, or a nucleus fragment drops, or even IOL, and it can be picked up with USG only. And the most important role of USG, once you see vitreous membrane attached to the disc, you look for is it a retina is on or is it off. So there are definite clues on the ACE amplitude scan and the brightness scan that will tell you you are dealing with RD or with PVD. Apart from that, the diabetes, where we are dealing with these patients, the VR surgeons have a tough time in knowing what's behind this vitreous hemorrhage. No other tool apart from the USG will give you this sort of information. What are you dealing with? Is it a tabletop RD there? Is it going to be repairable, or am I able to finish this surgery? So no other tool can give you this kind of a picture there. And as we move on with the newer high resolution probes, you can pick up information like CMEs and optic disc cupping also for the prognostication of these patients. And trauma, as I've already said, is a nightmare for any VR clinic, because all the things are now mixed up here. You have hemorrhage mixed up with RD, with choroidal detachment. So picking a choroidal detachment, hemorrhagic or serous, can be done by USG, and not only diagnosis, but it will give you a clue when to operate in these patients. Because once they start lysing, only then you take up these hemorrhagic choroidal cases. Cases like posterior perforation cannot be picked by any etiology, but by the USG only. And then retained intraocular foreign bodies, using a non-radiation, non-invasive procedure, USG, you can diagnose and even localize these magnetic and non-magnetic foreign bodies like cilias, glass, iron, whatever you want to see. So in this study from our center, recently published, we saw that the trauma is the most unreliable factor in USG. If you have a reliability criteria of preoperatively analyzing your USG finding, the trauma is the one where are you most likely to miss there, but the sensitivity is something like 99%. And if you take further in this unpublished data, we have seen that in trauma is not the foreign body. Foreign body can be localized very easily with good sensitivity. It's the posterior perforation which is most likely to miss. Okay, so we showed here that the USG is to be done, taken very meticulously in cases of trauma, and the findings that we may miss some of our USG on USG are more in cases of trauma. Uveitis, because of the inflammation there, we are not able to see the media clearly. So you need USG in the situations where media is grade 4 to 5, and things like the choroidal thickening, exudative bodies can be picked by none other tool than USG only. And literature has enough evidence now that infective etiologies, they have some kind of a picture there. There is a very high sensitivity of picking a toxoplasmosis. If you see a lesion which is on the temporal to the disc and associated with focal thickening, it has to be a toxoplasmosis. If you see a peripheral granulomas radiating with radiating membranes, it has to be a toxochiasis. And nobody can miss a finding of a cysticercosis which can be picked on. You don't need these PET and MRIs for these. And of course, the granulomas due to any infective etiologies can be picked by USG. Till date, in opaque medias, to diagnose a VKH syndrome, you have to find whether the patient has retinochoroidal thickening or not. So it is their tool to pick retinochoroidal thickening. And to manage these patients, whether they're responding to steroids or immunosuppression or not, if you show or document the decrease in retinochoroidal thickening in the peripapillary areas, this can be done by USG. The advances, the people say that EDI is better, but we cannot do the extended depth imaging, OCT, in case of opaque media. So what we have done a work here in PGI, that we have used high resolution probe and using immersion scans instead of on the lid, we have found that the reliability of EDI and immersion USG is similar in case of USG. We can achieve same levels. And these pictures of T signs and these pictures of which are the sign of posterior scleritis cannot be missed on USG in opaque media. As I've already said, most of the times USG can make a diagnosis of intraocular tumors because the pictures are so classical in case of melanomas, in case of METs, in case of hemangiomas. Sometimes in case of atypical, where you need these entities like CT or MRIs, in these cases, the classical mushroom shape, the melanoma will not only, the USG will not only help making the diagnosis, it will also help to, how to manage these patients, how to move along, because there are classifications which have shown that if it is less than 10 millimeter height and all that, you can, it will vary your treatment. And of course, this entity, the entity of leukocoria, all the DDs of the leukocorias can only be enrolled with USG only. So the reality is, this is a beautiful line by Dr. Gass, it is highly dependent on somebody, the ultrasonographer. He has to be very skilled, his technique has to be perfect, and his interpretation and dedication is very important in case of USG. So it is very subjective and it has to be, mastered there. So as we move along to MRIs and PETs, as I've already said, they do have role in intraocular tumors, but the real role is in, a better role is in finding out the systemic the associations there. So in case of all the intraocular, the lymphoma, the PIOL, it is mandatory to subject them to CSF and MRI to pick up the brain involvement early. So it is the test where you are suspecting PIOL. Like in this lady, we had a lesion, the vitrectomy was done, we found NHL, and she was positive for the brain lesions there. As I've already said, intraocular tumors, it can confirm the findings of USG, but it is not better than the PET scan. And I'll spend some time on the PET scan because, as you know, the CT and MRI kind of anatomical imaging, and the differentiation is the PET is the functional imaging. Here we are, seeing the FDG, the fluorodeoxyglucose, which is competing with glucose, which is taken by normal cells. But since the glucose is metabolized, the FDG is accumulated in the cells. The normal cells accumulate them, and then camera picks them up. So that's how PET uses, this fundamental of increased FDG uptake by abnormal cells. So it has been used in case of masquerade syndrome, and it is more sensitive than MRI and CTs. And this young lady who was systemically asymptomatic presented with this yellowish lesion with exudative RD, and the clinical, the angio and the USG were favoring metastasis, and even her HRCTT picked up a malignant lesion in the right lung. But there is no other entity which can replace PET, which will provide this information that this malignant lesion in the right leg is not limited to lung, it has metastasized. All these hot areas are basically metastasis. The good thing with pool, or the best thing, is you can find out the primary there if there is an unknown primary. So if there is a formula there, like the amount of FDG uptake by organ, if it's more, that's probably the primary is there. And apart from masquerade, I said the new rules which are of PET are coming up, which are pertaining to eye. People have shown that in case of lymphoma, if you are not suspecting only the brain involvement, you can pick in a whole body PET scan the unusual sites, of the lymphomas, and a site where a biopsy is possible can be picked on lymphomas. And so is its role in sarcoidosis. Recent papers have shown that in any case of unexplained chronic uveitis, if you subject these patients to FDG, this is a Western literature which shows that chances of picking the granulomatous uveitis, the sarcoidosis, and tuberculosis are more, because you are able to pick lymph nodes which you can subject to tissue biopsy, and you can pick up the lesions which are unknown till now. Same with the tuberculosis. People have shown that in case of tuberculosis, in the studies are available in endemic and non-endemic areas, that you can diagnose cases of tuberculosis, and you can pick up the lesions in the body which can be subjected to tissue biopsy, and you can make a confirmative diagnosis of the active tuberculosis there. And of course you can also monitor your treatment on PET scan. Here is this example of a young lady which tells us that you should not blindly follow these MRI and PET, and once you are finding on PET, you should always do a tissue diagnosis before jumping onto a conclusion there. So this young girl presented with this mass lesion without any inflammation in the eye, 20/60 vision, and the clinical and angiographic and medicine favored metastasis, so we subjected her to PETs, and the rest of the investigations were normal. The tuberculosis was less than 10. The PET it showed that the increased uptake in the ovaries, and there is metastasis to liver, to peritoneum, all over, and the primary in the ovary, and we brought this news to the lady, and because her tumor markers were also high, the C and LDH were high, but before anything, the tissue biopsy is mandatory in these patients, because this was not the age, and this was not the picture for the ovary there. So peritoneal the tissue fluid was taken, and it showed beautifully the multiplex PCR was positive for two genome. This is MPB64 and IS61V0, and subsequently this lady was treated with the anti-tubercular treatment, and she did well. And as you can see that down picture, that this is pre-ATT and post-ATT, there is a decrease in uptake on the PET scan, and this is how we can look for the resolution of the disease. So to conclude my talk here, I would say the USG is still it's an irreversible tool. I don't see any tool at the present time which can replace the findings of USG. So it's going to stay there. Just that the probes and the resolutions are increasing. People have moved on to the 20 MHz, and but there are certain problems with the high resolution probes. And MRI, as per the diagnosis of the intraocular tumors, it's okay, but it has a limited role for posterior segment disorders. But as for PET, this is essential investigation for us, because these masquerading patients, sometimes we are the first physicians to have a look at them. So we should know and get them undergo PET scan. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.